Okay, so hopefully everyone who has wanted to join has joined. So I would like to first of all welcome you all to today's webinar on Grassland Systems, busting the myths on carbon sequestration, hosted by the British Society of Animal Science and the British Grassland Society and the Stapledon Memorial Trust. I am Dr. Felicity Crotty and Principal Consultant at the Global Land team at Ricardo. And we've got a delightful evening planned. So I'm very, very glad that you could all join us. So hopefully we'll have an insightful discussion on carbon stocks and sequestration across grassland ecosystems. So my background is more soil biology and soil health. So I'm delighted to chair this evening and get better informed on carbon sequestration. So just briefly, some housekeeping before we dive into the presentations. I'd like to try and remind everyone, our speakers in the audience, that it's specifically focused on carbon and carbon sequestration. Future webinars that we'll be having a series, we'll be exploring the broader topics of greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture and whole farm emissions. So those are slightly tangential to our talks today, which will be specifically focused on carbon. So stay tuned for deeper dives into those areas, and I'm sure there'll be more invites sent out and publicity around those webinars. We are recording the webinar today, and the speakers have kindly offered to make their presentations available in the members section of the BSAS website. So you'll be able to access them there. So this is a live event for all who've registered, but actually if you've not come today, then it will only be available on the members sections of the websites. So we've thrilled to be joined by experts in these field of carbon sequestration, including Professor Bridget Emmett, Principal Scientist at the UK CEH and current President of the British Ecological Society as well. Professor Gary Lanigan, Research Officer, Crops, Environment and Land Use Programme at Chargus. Anna Sellers, who's a senior consultant at SRUC, and Becky Wilson, who unfortunately couldn't join us, but she has sent a pre-recording in, so we will still find out about the Farm Carbon Toolkit, I'm sure. And together they'll help us uncover the facts and dispel the myths around carbon sequestration in grasslands. If you have any questions, please pop them in the chat and I will attempt to monitor that, and I will pull out some of the good ones or all of them. Who knows how many questions you guys have. And we've got quite an extensive session at the end to do that Q&A. And I've just realized I did create a little agenda to put on my screen and I haven't actually been sharing it. So it doesn't matter, I won't bother. Bridget, would you like to attempt to share your screen, and I'll just introduce you whilst you're doing that. Also, just a reminder, please can everyone switch off their microphones? I think the host has done that anyway, but just in case, we'll be doing that. Bridget, you're not on the starter page, just to say. Okay, so you are now. Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Whew. Okay.
Okay, let me introduce you first. So our first speaker of the evening is Professor Bridget Emmett, who, as I say, is Principal Scientist at UKCEH and current President of the British Ecological Society. With a career dedicated to advancing soil and ecosystem services, Bridget leads the Environment and Rural Affairs Monitoring and Modelling Programme. She formerly managed UKCEH's Soil and Land Use team, overseeing a large cohort of research staff and students and the Soil Monitoring Programme for Wales, if I remember correctly. Her expertise lies in coordinating multidisciplinary projects that inform national policies on soil health, ecosystem services and natural capital. British contributions have earned her numerous accolades, including an OBE for services to soil and ecosystem sciences in 2023, the Marsh Award for Climate Change Research and recognition for geospatial excellence. With an H index of 57 and over 10,000 citations, her research significantly influences policy and environmental practices at national levels. I am delighted to hand over to Bridget, who will explain what carbon sequestration is and how we might meet our net zero goals. Over to you, Bridget. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all that, and lovely to meet you all if virtually. And I just hope that I can help set the scene for the fabulous speakers following this. As Felicity said, I am a soil scientist. I love soils. I'm a bit passionate about them, and I love soil carbon. But I also want to just try and explain what the potential, but perhaps also slightly the limitations for soil carbon is helping us meet net zero. And just ignore that C on the title. Apparently, I can't actually type these days. So it is not surprising that we are super excited about the potential of soils and carbon. If you just look both UK and globally, but this bar chart is for the UK. Oh, sorry. We have a lot of carbon in our soil. In fact, there is way, way more carbon in our soil than in any vegetation. That still comes as a surprise to people who think, oh, there's more carbon in Amazon forests and what have you in the trees. It's not. It's all stuffed in the soil. So here you can see the total for the UK, where over 4,000 megatons of carbon is stuffed in our soils. And you can see where that is distributed across our habitats. So it isn't a daft question to think, well, we should be protecting these, and what more can it do in terms of helping us manage for net zero? But I just want to think, where does that carbon come from? So 11,000 years ago, the UK was scoured clean by glaciers. It was bare rock. The whole of us, all our islands was bare rock. And everything we see now in our soil and all the carbon that's stuffed in it has been generated over those 11,000 years. So you can see in this table here, by depth for England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, one estimate of how much carbon is stuffed in our soils. So this is the carbon stock. So here's our 4,000 million tons of carbon to a 1 meter depth. Now there's lots of controversy. How much actually is this? Some people, this is probably an underestimate. This was by Bradley in 2005. But the principle is this amount of carbon has been created over 11,000 years, okay? So bear with me, I'm going to do a little bit of math with you. So how much just naturally carbon is being gained by our soils over that time? If we just think about natural processes and then the agricultural management that we've done since we've learned we can manage our landscapes. So if you just follow me through, and these slides will be available so you can go back over them. The total UK carbon stock, as I said, is 4,562 million tons. Over 11,000 years, you can just do the math and you can divide by the area of the UK and you can get to that is 0.017 tons of carbon per hectare per year has gone into our soil. So then just because we often convert to carbon dioxide equivalents per hectare per year, you basically multiply by 3.67. So we're now up to a number of 0.062 tons of CO2 equivalent per hectare per year. UK greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture in 2020 was 44.8 million tons, which in red is 2.6 tons of CO2 equivalent per hectare per year. So just compare these two red numbers, okay? You can see that the amount that we put into our soil every year since we were just bare rock is way, way less than how much we need to capture if we're going to offset our greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Basically, natural with the history of our agriculture is just 2.3% of what we need, okay? So just naturally what's happened over time, so it wasn't even, it sort of probably is accelerated over time, it's just 2.3%. So our question is, can we accelerate this out? So all those natural processes with a bit of agriculture over 11,000 years, can we increase the amount of carbon that's going into our soil every year by increasing plant production and transfer to soil, using more regenerative agricultural practices, planting hedges, restoring peatlands? But remember, the definition of net zero is we have to have a net increase in the transfer of carbon from the atmosphere to the land, not just move it about the landscape. Or we have to decrease losses from the land, apologies for that, decreases losses from the land, so tillage or what have you. And we need to do this without using fossil fuels, which actually use more greenhouse gases than we can sequester into the soil. So for example, nitrogen fertilizers are incredibly embedded with fossil fuels in their formation, their transport, and when we apply them. So just pouring fertilizer on the soil to increase plant production, to get more carbon in the soil, is a perverse outcome. You're spending more carbon to create less carbon in the soil. So what are our options? Well, about a year ago, I pulled together some real fantastic people who are experts in peatlands, Chris Evans, forestry, Robert Matthews, soils in general, Pete Smith in Aberdeen, I'm sure many of you might know his name, and Amanda Thompson, who runs one of the greenhouse gas inventories, the greenhouse gas inventory for land use change and forestry, which we very often think is the counterpoint, is the one part of the inventory that actually should act as a sink for all our emissions. So I pulled them together and they created this short report, which I really encourage you to go and download off our RAMP website, because it tries to explain what is the opportunities and limitations of carbon catchment in soils and peatlands. Within this briefing note, we have this table where we show all the different options that people talk about that we could do for arable, for grassland, bits of woodland, wetlands, and mixed systems. And we also see what the carbon stocks are. But I want you to look at what the values for cool, moist systems, that basically means the UK. What the median is, that's what the most typical value is, and then the range. And I just want you to look, hopefully you can see on your screen the ranges in these brackets. So Pete Smith particularly helped do this, but everyone else. So they've gone to all the studies in the literature and said, okay, this person found a number of 0.01, this of tons of CO2 per hectare per year. This study found this study found this, and they've done ranges. And what you can see is the ranges are huge. And this is our cautionary tale to you, is that a lot of what you see in social media, people will say, I've managed to do this. One study might not replicate to your land on your soil type for the climate that you have and the system you have. It's hugely variable. So in summary, that table, I've just tried to simplify it here for you. And I know you're mainly interested in grassland, but just bear with me. So remember, the average UK greenhouse gas emissions per hectare per year, hugely variable, is 2.67 tons. Look at these average values and the extremes. So there are some times when we can more than offset this, but they are occasional studies. They're not the typical. And you've got to remember for some things that there's only so much land you can put a hedge on. So this is per hectare. And we've only got so many wetlands that we can restore. And arable, I live in Wales, we haven't got that much arable, frankly. So even though there's a 6.2 here potential, we don't have that much arable. So grassland, if you just look, has the lowest, well, just as an intermediate average value, and its top rates are really not as high as we have potential in some of the other habitat systems. So this is just reminding us that it's hugely variable, and grassland potentially hasn't got as many options as arable, where we know we've depleted carbon and therefore we've got more to gain than we have in grassland systems. And then there are new options that everyone's getting very excited about, like enhanced rock weathering and biochar. Now, they have got potential, but we need more testing. So I'm running a testing site for enhanced rock weathering. This is where you put on basalt rock, and the idea is that as it dissolves, the rainwater, the CO2 in the rainwater actually starts to form carbonates. And you can actually grab CO2 out the atmosphere and put it into the soil. The pH goes up, the production goes up, you put carbon into the soil. The problem is it's in testing phase. We just cannot say what the numbers are at the moment. And also for enhanced rock weathering, if every farmer wants some of this instead of lime, they want to go to basalt rock, we will have to open up a whole lot of new quarries and mines. Is that acceptable to the general public? So is the transporting that around the country, the quarrying of it, is that going to more than offset the carbon that we actually managed to build into the soil? So there's these things are still in testing phase, because we need to test them. When does it work? Which locations, which soil types, which systems does it work? So we're testing this in improved grasslands, we're testing it in unimproved grasslands, we're testing it in arable systems and in forests. Sorry. So a few things jump out when you look at that. Net carbon gain is hugely variable. The more degraded your soil is, the more carbon we can stuff into it. And it's generally accepted that you get this saturation curve, that there is a limit to how much carbon you can put into a soil just because of the amount of clays. There's only so many surfaces that we can do. And building organic matter in particulate form is very vulnerable to being released over time. And that means it's not permanent. But then again, trees can go up in a puff of smoke in a fire, and biodiversity net gain, someone can just destroy species. So the fact it's not permanent isn't that unique to soil carbon. An uptake currently of many of the practices that can increase soil carbon is still quite limited. And I just want to remind everyone that the use of manures and straw just move carbon around the system. There's no net increase in carbon unless something like the straw was going to be burned, and then it was going to do. So manure is captured carbon already, and the fact that you put it on your field compared to the other field, there's no net carbon being additionally removed out of the system. And just to depress us all even more, currently no country in the UK has reported an increase in topsoil carbon over the last 30 years. So since 1970, arable has steadily decreased. We've got a little increase in fertile grassland, and in our other semi-natural systems, there's quite complexity going over. But we've lost 11% of our topsoil carbon since 1978. In our peatland soils, we've lost even more, potentially 50 to 80% of our carbon. Now, just to excite you, the next data point from this countryside survey program that UKCH runs is going to report in 2025. So we're looking to see whether all the great activities farmers are doing is now managing to reverse or even accelerate some of these. But I just come back to, even if it is increasing them, the rate is unlikely to help completely mitigate greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. And this is the challenge we've got. So agriculture currently, I'm sorry this is Wales, but the story is the same for UK, currently emits about 6,000 kilotons of CO2 per year. Currently, land use change and forestry basically mops up between half and 500 and 1,000 kilotons. So we've got 5,000 kilotons to try and reduce to get to net zero, okay, a year. And none of the options that I was describing gets anywhere near that. And in the EU, just to emphasize the lack of permanence that we think of in this area, they've got an EU carbon removals and carbon farming certification program. And the carbon farming sequestration unit, look at this, they consider it temporary. And for every unit you claim here, you have to recertify every 5 years to say it's still there. And it only considers managements that go beyond common practice. So when we ask this fantastic set of authors, what do you consider soil carbon? What the most, when you think of the limited land, uptake, what the rates are, how much can soil carbon really help mitigate the UK agricultural emissions? The number, I'm sorry to say, is only 5 to 10%. That doesn't mean to say we shouldn't do it. Soil carbon is great for soil health. It's increased resilience for moisture and drought, and this nutrient cycling. It avoids erosion. We really, really need to do that, but we really need to moderate our language about how much it might help us meet net zero. And if we don't, this is the risk. We lack focus and action on emissions of other greenhouse gases, focusing on things like nitrogen use efficiency and matching crop needs to fertilizer inputs, thinking about the number of ruminant animals that really is sustainable in our systems, waste and circular solutions. If we keep saying soil carbon can do it all, we're really not, we're just moving emphasis away from these other things that we really need to change. So I'm really not trying to say we shouldn't increase soil carbon in our soils. It's great for so many things, but there is a limit to what it can do to help us meet net zero. And with that, Felicity, I'll stop sharing, and thanks for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. That was brilliant. Really, really, really good, actually. We've got a couple of questions, but we're going to hold out for the discussion session at the end. So I'm not going to ask you any questions on it now. I am reliably informed that our next speaker, Gary, is either running late or there's been an issue. So we're going to slightly rearrange the agenda, and I'm going to introduce Anna right now, who will give a talk first. So Anna Sellers is an economic and policy consultant with SAC's Consulting's Food and Enterprise team, specializing in low carbon economies and emerging carbon markets. Anna has worked on rural development studies, the impacts of Brexit on Scottish agriculture, and policy development for the Scottish Government. Anna is part of the AgriCalc team, helping deliver carbon services and advice across sectors with a focus on making sustainability both practical and economically advantageous, supporting the farming industry's transition to low carbon and net zero targets. So the perfect yin and yang to Bridget's talk, I feel. So Anna, if you want to share your slides and we can begin.
That's perfect. You're seeing my slides okay?
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for the introduction, Felicity. And Bridget set the scene really well there. And I was reading with interest, watching with interest, because I think it will link in nicely to some of the aspects that I'd like to pick up on in my brief talk about the carbon marketplace and what does sequestration mean within that. I'll just mention, I'll follow up from my introduction. I previously worked with AgriCalc. I've sort of since stepped back from AgriCalc since they spun out as a separate company. So I'm familiar with the tool, very familiar with the tool, no longer actively involved and pursuing other interests, but I have that background and I'm involved in delivering a course on carbon markets for BSAS currently with ADAS. So I'll delve straight in there, and apologies if this is going back to basics for some, but I always find that's a good place to start. One of the fundamentals, the fundamental to carbon markets is carbon credits. So I thought I'd start with what is a carbon credit? And a carbon credit is a tradable incentive that allows businesses to offset their emissions by funding carbon avoidance or removals elsewhere. And essentially 1 ton of CO2 equivalent, so that's CO2, or it could also include methane and nitrous oxide in an agricultural context as equivalents represented as CO2 equivalent. 1 ton of CO2 equivalent is 1 carbon credit. Basically, these are used then, 1 carbon credit is used to avoid CO2 emissions elsewhere, so offset emissions that can't be avoided in other industries. So land-based sectors like agriculture and forestry can either sequester and store carbon, or can also be produce emissions and require offsets themselves, as Bridget covered just earlier. There's 2 main carbon credit markets. There's 2 main types. There's compliance markets, which are government regulated. They're required by governments across some industries and some sectors, not all. And these require companies to reduce emissions through reporting. And offset credits within compliance markets are quite regulated. They're managed through systems such as the EU cap and trade, which you might have come across. And since Brexit, we've also got a UK emissions trading scheme as well. But when we're talking about carbon sequestration and carbon markets, typically what's been in the press a lot in recent years is talk around voluntary carbon markets. And these are optional participation markets, and they're based on an industry or a business's interest in opting into participation in these markets. So, and these can cover all industries, any industry, whereas compliance only covers, I think, about 40% of the UK GDP output, for example. So key features of these 2 different markets then, I wanted to link them back to sort of what do they mean for agriculture. And there's a large list there of reporting requirements under compliance carbon markets, which I won't go into in detail. It's really as a reference point. But you can see that sectors are required to report under the national inventory on their greenhouse gas emissions. And I've just listed there some examples of current reporting requirements for businesses from the EU, and some that also relate now to UK businesses. And these don't have any direct application currently to agriculture, but they may have some indirect impact in that businesses that or supply chains that agriculture will be feeding into will be increasingly required to commit to those compliance targets. So we're going to see an increasing amount of the kind of indirect impacts from those. But in terms of the voluntary carbon markets, the main mechanisms for these currently is the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code, which I'm sure most people are quite familiar with, and new carbon codes, which are very much in discussion at the moment, the Soil Carbon Code, which is currently in development, Hedgerow Code, and we know of others as well, the Salt Marsh Code, etc. And also initiatives like the Science Based Targets initiatives. So as I mentioned, agriculture and land use can be a potential source of carbon credits, but it can also be a sector that, as Bridget illustrated very well in the graph, a sector that needs to offset itself. I always think that there's, from my experience, there's three main options for selling carbon as a farmer or a land user. One is to generate carbon credits to sell as offsets to other industries. The second would be to reduce emissions and or generate carbon credits from insetting projects. And I'll touch in a couple of slides on what those are. So insetting within your own supply chain or your own business. And the third option might be to attract investment for environmental social governance projects. So not necessarily creating carbon credits, but to attract that investment to put into carbon projects. And I'll provide these slides as a reference point for later. In terms of the process for selling carbon credits, this is very much a generalized and simplified approach, but across the main carbon credit buyers that we see now in the marketplace, this is a typical process, is that you would start with doing a baseline measurement of the land that you're generating carbon credits from. You'd then really want to understand the selling options, and also the criteria for those options. What does it mean for implementation? What does it mean for the business risk? And what conditions are you required to meet currently in implementation, also into the future? Then there would be the phase of implementation. And then following that implementation, you would want to do an assessment of the progress of the project, and then also verification. And verification can take the form of modelling or measurement or both. We're seeing, I think, a lot of the bigger buyers are using more of a modelling approach supplemented by some measurements. And then once that's all passed, then you'd be able to sell those credits through whichever channels. We're also seeing the increasing interest in supply chains, producer groups as well, and cooperatives to add value through low carbon products. So not necessarily going down the carbon credit route, but using carbon reductions or carbon sequestration from land to then increase the carbon credentials of the products. And there's some good examples of this. There's been Heineken working with barley groups. Diageo have been working with some of their suppliers as well. Some of the milk suppliers have been looking into this. And I was having a conversation just the other day of a hemp group that was looking to assess the carbon credentials of the crop and the supply chain to be able to offer a low carbon product. And these definitions are regulated in the UK. I can't say how regulated they are in other parts of the world, but certainly in the UK they are regulated, and there are certification options such as through the Carbon Trust. And this is what we might describe as insetting as opposed to offsetting. I wanted to provide a bit of an overview of typical carbon prices from different markets. So the top two are compliance carbon markets prices, and you can see that they're quite a bit higher than those that would sit in voluntary carbon markets currently. So at the moment, Woodland Carbon Code, Peatland Carbon Code, and then estimates for the Soil Carbon Code would be anything from 10 to perhaps 30 pounds per tonne of carbon. And there's lots of different factors that influence the price of a carbon credit in voluntary markets. The cost of producing it, supply and demand in markets, the quality and assurance is one of the big factors there as well in terms of determining how much it's worth on the open market. And other benefits as well from that, not just carbon, if you can prove and monitor and verify those. Bridget gave some great statistics and workings for a kind of reality check, fact check of what does it mean for for land managers. And this is something we did as part of a project 3 years ago, I think now, where we took an average farm size in Scotland, because it was a Scotland-based project, of 140 hectares. And we said, well, what if this farm was to sequester carbon to a typical amount based on a research value, which I've referenced here, over a 20-year period, how many tons of carbon would that generate, and how much would that be worth on the open market? And we worked out how much revenue that would generate, and it really wasn't very much. And that's not to be depressing, but it was to kind of counteract some of the narratives that sequestration credits might be worth tens of thousands, which was not what we were seeing on a typical farm. So the conclusion from this was, currently anyway, scale is key for being able to generate carbon credits in the voluntary sector, in the voluntary marketplace, from a typical sized farm. And these figures are not even accounting for the costs of implementation or transactional costs of sale and verification, etc. So the project kind of concluded with some highlighting some of the opportunities, but also the risks and the barriers from carbon markets as it currently stands. So we're still very much at SAC as sort of urging caution around the level of regulation in voluntary carbon markets at the moment, and also the requirements of permanence and additionality that exist within different schemes. They can be highly variable. Some of them can be quite suspect, I have to say. And also there are still quite high transactional costs and low return for engaging in that. So some of the questions we kind of highlight for land managers is to try and understand what are your current carbon stocks, and what's the potential for carbon offsets, carbon credits on the farm. Can you produce on the scale and for the right market? What's the cost of producing those? But also, what are the risks and liabilities and the implications for the business in pursuing that route? And one of the other things I wanted to flag in this presentation as well is, are there other ways to add value from carbon sequestration other than going down an offset route? So I'll just finish with what's on the horizon at the moment for land-based carbon credit production. We are seeing carbon codes and standards evolve. There is a lot of work going on behind the scenes to regulate, but also support and facilitate voluntary markets in a responsible way, at a national level and at an international level. And we are seeing a lot of interest as well from the private sector and investors wanting to invest in this space. And there's also evolution of the sophistication of stacking and bundling, so the ability to then add on multiple, or package up multiple benefits from a measure, and sort of add value to the outputs from projects that might include carbon sequestration as well. But lots more steps need to be taken to create a transparent and a trustworthy and a beneficial carbon marketplace for farmers to be engaging with these, in our opinion anyway. So we definitely think there needs to be a better understanding of the implications of carbon markets on land use and land use change in the UK, and more innovation around scalability and reducing those transactional costs. Great, I think I'll leave it there. I hope I've not gone too much over time.
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much, Anna. It was really interesting, and I've learned a lot about carbon credits because I'm not the expert in that area. So I've been told by the British Society of Animal Science that Gary's not going to unfortunately make it this evening. So instead of so there will only be 3 speakers rather than 4, but as everyone is ever so slightly longer than we were expecting, it is absolutely fine, and everyone, it's almost as like we've planned it. So our final speaker for the evening, before we get to the discussion section, is Becky Wilson. Now, Becky unfortunately couldn't be with us this evening, but instead she's done a brilliant pre-recording, which will hopefully work well across the airwaves. So Becky Wilson is the Business Development and Technical Director of the Farm Carbon Toolkit. She joined Farm Carbon Toolkit in 2014 following her work on the Swarm Knowledge Hub, where she helped farmers in the Southwest manage resources sustainably. As part of that project, she contributed to developing the Farm Crap app, a tool for calculating the nutritive value of livestock manures. Becky is a strong advocate for showcasing the economic benefits of sustainable farming and divides her time between the Farm Carbon Toolkit and Duchy College Rural Business School as a technical specialist in resource management. In 2016, she was awarded a Nuffield Scholarship to enhance communication of carbon reduction schemes to farmers. If I remember correctly, she was also quite heavily involved in the Bury Your Pants initiative as well, and looking at how pants degrade in soil. So it's always quite an interesting talk between me and her, usually revolving around random things you bury. So without further delay, if Sinead, if you could release the video, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Becky Wilson, and it's a real pleasure to be on this webinar this evening, talking very much on this subject of busting the myths on carbon sequestration. What I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking to you about is very much around how do we advise farmers and manage expectations when we think about the potential that we can deliver in terms of, for grassland systems specifically, around delivering some of these solutions to climate change. So the work that I'm involved with very much is with the Farm Carbon Toolkit. We are a farmer-led organisation really aiming at trying to provide practical tools and resources for farmers on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving energy resilience, improving business resilience, with a particular focus on soil health. We've been around since sort of 2008. So we've been in this space really thinking about these sort of topics for quite a while. We spend a lot of our time out on farm, helping farmers understand how they can navigate the challenges that we have at the moment, specifically around greenhouse gas emissions, soil health, but also how that impacts on what they're trying to do day to day. We do a range of different measurement options around carbon calculators and spend a lot of time down holes looking at measuring soil carbon sequestration and then linking that into soil health. And so I suppose what I'm going to try and go through over the next few minutes is really understand, well, how do we start to have these conversations with farmers in a way which is robust scientifically, which helps meet them where they are in terms of at this center point between understanding what do we actually need to do on the farm? How do we start to see the benefits of some of these metrics and some of these environmental measures that are coming down? But fundamentally, how does that also help me as a farmer? So if we think about the broader perspective in terms of sequestration, why is that important when engaging farmers? And why is this something that really needs to be part of that discussion? Well, put really, really simply, if we look at how carbon footprinting is done across farms, which often is the first experience that farmers have in terms of being able to sort of come up against this issue, a lot of the metrics that are used are probably quite good and quite efficient in terms of being able to measure the emissions that are coming from grass-based systems. We have carbon footprinting calculations, we have databases of information in terms of being able to quantify what's going on in terms of the emissions from carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide that are arising from these production systems, with some caveats obviously in terms of the fact that we're getting better and better at being able to do those. So if we think about our ability as an individual farm or as a supply chain or as an industry to be able to reach net zero, and if we think about the two sides of that, we're getting better in terms of being able to quantify what's going on from an emissions perspective. We can also start to put some values in terms of some of those things which are removing carbon from the atmosphere. And they may be things like the amount of hedgerows on farm, the amount of trees on the farm, any areas that we might have that are in environmental schemes. And so often then, if we're looking at a footprint for a farm that is quite extensive and is predominantly based on grass, you'll get something that's similar to the one that's on the screen there. We've got a proportion of emissions. We've then got a small amount of offset, which is that green bar in the middle, which is predominantly coming on this occasion from, as I say, hedgerows and trees. And then we're left with that carbon balance. And so often when we're sat around the kitchen table having these conversations with farmers, going through this process, this is the starting point for some of those conversations. And what tends to then happen is you get this point, well, where do I put in my grass? And we then end up with those sorts of conversations about, well, how are we able to enter grass into these systems? And this is the big challenge. And this is where, as again, we sort of say, well, we can look very much about what's going on from an emissions perspective, but currently farmers are then thinking, well, we're not best representing what's happening on the other side in terms of where we might be taking that carbon out of the atmosphere and holding it in those different reservoirs. And we know that there are multiple challenges in terms of doing that. But this is what, as I say, often where this conversation starts. So if we unpack this in a little bit more detail in terms of how do we actually get to a point where we can have a much more nuanced conversation, well, where are the challenges? Well, often farmers don't have a huge amount of a back catalogue of soil sample data that they've done over many years. We know that obviously the best time that we should have all started measuring this sort of stuff was 20 years ago, because we can't sort of conjure up all this historical data. And potentially we've got farmers that may well have done some soil testing in the past that's looked at organic matter or organic carbon, but potentially they haven't done it in a consistent way. They may have changed labs. They may have not got that consistent picture through the fields. It then means that actually it's very difficult to actually input accurate information into carbon calculators, which will give an understanding of what's happening in terms of soil carbon sequestration under those grasslands. That therefore leads to a fact that there's a little bit of distrust from our farmers in terms of the metrics. So the metrics are very, getting them to the point where they're understanding what's happening from an emissions perspective, but there is often this feeling that they're not providing that balanced picture. So we're being hit with the stick, but we're not able to accurately account for the good stuff that's going on our farms. We've also got this issue in terms of building up that evidence base. So as I say, we can't wave a magic wand and suddenly deliver a huge amount of soil analysis results without having done that in the past. So we can certainly start and understand the importance of baselining now, but in terms of them being able to feed that information into the carbon calculators, we need to build that evidence base up over time. And again, that can be quite a tricky message to then have conversations with farmers about, where we haven't got bespoke information of what's going on their farm. So how can we then start to show them the art of what might be possible when we haven't got that on-farm data? The other thing that's very important, and certainly from the work that we've been doing over the past sort of 8 to 10 years, looking through our soil carbon project, is that it's really important to understand when we're doing testing, it's not just the total amount of carbon that's in our soil, but where that carbon is. And specifically when we think about grasslands and the ability of those grasslands to continue to sequester carbon, often that ability comes when we start to look at where that carbon is distributed within the soil profile. So again, this comes back to that challenge of, it may well be that farmers have done some testing in the past, but if they've only included those organic matter tests as an add-on with their nutrient tests, potentially we're only looking at what's going on in those top couple of inches of soil. So again, making sure that if we are then doing that baselining, we're making sure that we're giving ourselves the most robust baseline to start with. But also the challenge that we have in terms of sequestration, building carbon within soils, is a slow, long-term process. And if we think about all of the challenges and the uncertainties that farmers are facing at the moment, it can be quite difficult to then start to think about, how do we build in management systems? How do we do this if we're just focusing on carbon that are going to have potentially have these benefits in the very long term, when what we need to know is actually how can we manage our farm over the next 6 to 12 months and over the next couple of years. So these can be some of the issues when we're sitting, thinking and talking with farmers that we need to be aware of. The other really important thing when we have these discussions is that actually we need to make sure that we do not become carbon tunnel visioned. Okay, so when we're thinking about potential adaptation in our management on farm, when we're thinking about all of these sorts of things, we need to be not making sure that we're just making those decisions on what's happening from a carbon perspective. We also need to be thinking about what's happening much more widely in terms of what makes sense for our farm, what makes sense in terms of from a soil health perspective, from a grassland and a livestock perspective, and how that fits within the overall resilience of our system. Because if we're making those decisions only on the back of the fact that potentially there is markets, potentially we're being asked to do this from a retailer or a policy perspective, then potentially we're not doing what is most important for our farm. And especially when we think about the challenges that our farms have in terms of managing these multiple resources in an era of climate change where things are becoming much more difficult. If we're making those management decisions on a sound footing in terms of what makes sense for our farm, then actually it sets us very much off on a good path moving forward. So is carbon the most important? Well, at the moment, it can seem that that very much is. If we think about some of the pressures that are coming down our supply chain from retailers, where actually achieving those net zero targets is key as part of what they're thinking about at the moment, especially as we start to get closer to 2030, and some of those pressures in terms of delivering impact is going to come quite quickly. Policymakers sometimes, depending on what is the focus those, within that week or within that month, but we're certainly seeing this downward pressure. But I would argue when we think about what is the most important for us at a farm level, carbon is one of those important things, but it's not the most important thing. So the key question and the way that we are breaching this with farmers is to start to have those conversations around how do we do those things, or how do we understand the potential to improve carbon sequestration at the same time as improving wider soil health, business performance, business resilience. Because if we're doing it for that reason, then we as a business or we as a farm are going to have benefits over and above potentially those wider arching benefits that are going to help outside of our farm. And that really starts by making sure that the farms that we're working with and the farmers are engaged with their soils. And I think we've been, as I say, over the last 10 years, when we've been out spending a lot of time, like this image, round a hole, looking at what's going on, engaging and ensuring that our soil health is optimal is that first key priority. Making sure we're getting the basics right. So actually, yes, organic matter percentages, yes, organic carbon percentages, yes, where they are at different depths. But fundamentally for a grassland system, is our soil in the correct structure? Do we have the ability for that soil to hold on to water, to cycle nutrients, to support soil biodiversity? And all of that comes by actually making sure that we are getting down and looking and getting engaged with our soils. And my slight worry with some of this focus on carbon is that potentially we deliver those solutions that are much more technological, whether it's through remote sensing, whether it's through automated sampling, and we miss that opportunity to make sure that farmers are continually engaged with their soils. So we cannot avoid the use of that spade. We cannot avoid the fact that we need to get out, we need to dig holes, we need to understand how our soils are performing, because that very much is that sweet spot in terms of where we can get that farmer engagement. We can understand what's going on, as well as them being able to deliver some of that data that's required. Because a key part of that discussion is actually, it's not about the fact that this is grassland, therefore this is either good or bad from a sequestration perspective. It very much has to be the hook to then have that conversation about, well, how are we managing that grassland? What are we doing in terms of our grazing practices, in terms of our species diversity, in terms of our soil health and our rooting depth? Because that's absolutely where we can start to help equip these farmers to understand what they can do over the short, the medium and the long term. And another really important thing about that soil health is that actually in those interim periods between where we are delivering that data in terms of our robust data around soil carbon, those seeing changes in those soil health indicators can help keep that journey going. So actually seeing that your soil is structuring better, seeing that it's holding more water, seeing that your aggregates are more stable, understanding that you've got more worms, which are a really good indicator species, helps encourage that engagement and help show that that farm is moving in the right direction. So just to sort of try and bring it together, You know, we know that, as I say, when we sit at those discussions and at the kitchen tables, measurement of carbon, and I'm sure, as I say, it's been a topic of discussion this evening, can be challenging. It can seem confusing and overwhelming, both from a carbon footprinting perspective. How do we measure? How many samples do we need to take? How often do we need to do that? That can be really confusing and overwhelming, and it can lead some farmers to be like, actually, I'm just not going to bother. But it's really important that we collect that data, because the data allows the demonstration of that impact. And that data needs to be at farm level. We've got lots of farms where we've been working at where we can see the potential for these soil carbon to improve, but that data needs to be there. And by collecting that data, we can start to include that. But in terms of advising farmers at that farm level, we are really needing to focus on what helps that farm improve. How can we help improve soil health and function, and understand how that's linked to current management? What makes sense for that farm, and how will that improve building resilience as we move into this era of uncertainty? Because it's not just about saying we have grass. It's about making that much more iterative in terms of how are we managing that grass, especially when we think about different depths. So by providing that evidence in terms of, yes, looking at laboratory analysis data, but linking that into soil health, we can then empower our farmers to be able to understand the differences between how their fields are currently managed, and then make those changes, which will help improve the soil health, will also help improve the business resilience, and will help the industry for the future. Thank you ever so much for listening. As I say, I'm more than happy to have any questions. My email address is on the slide, so please get in contact, and I look forward to carrying on the conversations.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, thank you, Becky, although obviously she's not here to hear that. So I've just been informed that, bless him, Gary, I think, is potentially in hospital, which is why he isn't here today. I wonder if I could lean on Bridget slightly to maybe just give a quick off-the-cuff overview of discussing the measurement problems with soil carbon, which Gary was going to cover. I sorry.
Oh my goodness, right. And actually that hits some of the questions that are in the chat, and apologies, Zoom threw me out of the system. So I've lost some of the messages, but I can see some of the other ones. So the issues with soil carbon is quite hard, because traditionally we've measured it in bulk, right? Total soil carbon, and that changes quite slowly, and it is quite variable. And so we've got a few problems there. Also, as Becky's just described, there's quite a lot of interest that many of the monitoring programs only had money to do topsoil. And we're worried that we might be missing carbon that's gone to depth. And of course, they're all valid points, but global syntheses and everything else suggests that what we manage generally is the topsoil with our ploughing and with everything else. Now, if you go to the Great Plains of America, they have got the most astonishing grass species that have 2-meter rooting, roots that go to depth. And I just really caution people about thinking about those studies, because our soils are not that deep. We have glaciated soils, and a lot of our plants don't go to that depth. So we've got to be really careful about taking American, Australian dryland systems and applying them to our moist, cool systems here. But in essence, trying to measure a small change in a large pool is quite hard. There are now nice papers, very recent papers about, well, can we start digging into that carbon box and thinking whether we want to really look at the mineral associated carbon, because that's the stabilized carbon, versus the particulate carbon, which is, if you like, little bits of peat and plant material that are just lodged between the soil particles. So we're trying to get at that to see if we can get a more dynamic way of measuring the change in soil carbon. The issue being that it looks like the particulate carbon that we all get very excited about and seems most responsive is the least permanent of the carbon. We want carbon that's sticking to mineral fractions in the soil, because then it's stabilized, then we're more convinced it's sitting in there. So there's the whole approach of taking a soil core, right? So then people are going, well, let's forget that, let's do greenhouse gas fluxes. The problem with greenhouse gas fluxes is that Well, one, when you mean greenhouse gas flux. So these are towers that measure the net exchange of CO2 in versus CO2 out, which some flux towers do. Then others do also the N2O and the methane. If you're talking about total greenhouse gases, you need to do all three. With the CO2 exchange, what you are missing, so some of those show that there is a net input of carbon into the soil. None of us are saying there is no net carbon not going into the soil. What we are saying is the amount of that is relatively small relative to the emissions. And also, when you're doing it on pasture land, are the animals around? Because they're also emitting a lot of gases. And also, are you taking account of all the greenhouse gases that have been used to create the fertilizers that you've applied to your system? So at the end of the day, the total soil carbon is kind of the definitive. Have you got more carbon in your soil, yes or no? Because the fluxes are equally problematic in that it's going to be flat land. They can't do it when, you know, some of the climatic conditions, they have to do a lot of infill. There's problems with all of this measuring. But I think what is really interesting, I wasn't actually sure what Anna and Kirsty was going to say, but we're all saying the same. This is not to say our pasture soils aren't capturing carbon, but the rate that they're doing in our cool, moist systems is just not offsetting that big emission release due to the fertilizers we put on and the ruminants that unfortunately convert lovely carbon in grass into these highly potent N2O and methane emissions. So we've just got to be realistic that that's what grassland systems are for. It's for ruminants. And how much carbon can we stuff in the soil? Naturally, it's quite slow. To depth, most of our plants don't go to that huge depth, and we manipulate the top bit. And that's why even the IPCC says we will look at the top 30 centimeters, because that's the bit that we basically manage. That's the bit that climate affects. That's where most changes are likely to happen. So we keep trying to go, oh, it's going to be more, it's at depth, it's what have you. All I can say is all the studies, and I see the challenge that some of our studies are a bit old. I mean, I've got new studies here, cover crops just out 2023. It's actually worse. There's no evidence at all cover crops increase carbon when you actually take account of bulk density and what have you. So actually, the more studies we get, the actually more challenging some of these numbers become. I want to believe soil carbon is the solution. Do not get me wrong. I want everyone to increase their soil carbon and their soil organic matter. But I just think we need to be realistic. And the studies that are coming out now that are robust scientifically, you know, and that take account of carbon, of soil bulk density, so it's not just concentration, and that it's about that it's actually about real sequestration, not just moving carbon about the landscape. They're not changing the scientific robust evidence. There's lots of blogs saying I've quadrupled my carbon, what have you, but in terms of real numbers, using accredited labs, using proper scientific methods, I'm really sorry, everyone, but it's just not changing what you've now heard from 3 separate people who we didn't confer before we came on here. So I'll leave it there, Felicity, if I may.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. And also, I mean, you touched on it just then. It's if you're using different measurements to measure carbon, then they are not comparable across the different labs and the different systems, whether it's the depth you're taking. Soil type is also a factor. So if you've got sandy soils, you are never going to store as much carbon in them as a heavy clay. So that's something to take into account. I'm not supposed to be giving answers though.
So can I just come in on that method thing? We tend to sort of go, oh, well, it's hopeless because labs do different things and methods. If you do one method and you keep to it and you track over time, it's fine. Now, if you dodge about and go, I'm going to use this tool today and that tool tomorrow in this lab playing the game, you won't get good numbers. But if you just choose a decent method and follow it through, you can track your changes over time, but it's going to be slow, but it's really worthwhile. But just because different methods give you slightly different results, just keep to one and continue to do it. Just make sure you do a proper, you know, a good method and use a good lab and stick with it. If you dart around trying to play the game, you just aren't going to get good numbers. Sorry, Felicity, just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
No, that's sort of a better articulated version of what I was trying to say. Rather than bombard you with questions, I'm going to go to Anna for a different question, which somebody actually quite early on in your presentation asked it in relation to are there so I know that you've got your woodland carbon code, there's potential emission reduction credits, you've got potential peatland credits, soil capital. So we're wondering if there's any moves to develop some sort of biodiversity credits in parallel to carbon credits as well. There seems to be a lot of credit schemes being discussed. I don't know if you know.
That is a good question. I have to say biodiversity is not something I'm very expert on. I know in Scotland there is work ongoing as to generating biodiversity metrics, and that is collaboration with Scottish government and researchers. But of course that's more at a public scheme level. I don't know about voluntary schemes for biodiversity. I can't really comment on them, I'm afraid. But I do know that obviously different sort of natural landscapes and habitats are being looked at. I think we mentioned salt marsh. There's various at the moment, and obviously blue carbon as well.
Absolutely.
I'd seen a comment in the chat, just going back briefly to the previous conversation around models, standardization of models and calculators, and there was a comment in the chat about the lack of standardization about carbon footprinting calculators and models. And I just wanted to mention that there are some very recent and current projects ongoing across some of the key carbon calculators to standardize and harmonize the methods and approaches. I'm not saying that it will be common standardization, but there's going to be much more alignment across the calculators, and that's come following quite a large report. I think it's commissioned by HDB, and so that was released last year, and there is work that is following from that's very much live and current about that. Obviously I'm no longer actively involved in that work, but I know it's ongoing.
Okay, that's really good to know. I was going to ask you that question in a bit, so you might have ruined my plan for alternating questions. Is what I would say. So actually, somebody in the chat, it was the very first question, but I'm going to slightly reword it because it was actually the question that I had in effect from Bridget's presentation, which is, so you talk about how there's been a very, very small amount relatively of carbon built up over the last 11,000 years. Do you think that carbon was built up at a sort of constant rate over that time? Or would you say that actually, like, I mean, there must be some sort of carbon dating that you could potentially do with it to work out how it was stored over that 11,000 year period? Because I would assume that in the sort of agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, that the rate of sequestration will have changed.
Yeah, no, it's am I off mute? Yeah. It's a really good point. I just did it to try and set context. Nothing would have been linear in that time. So rates, what we generally find is rates would have been relatively small because at the time you were just rock and a few lichens grew, they died and they did carbon. And then you gradually got minerals were broken up and created surfaces. So it will have accelerated over time. I just wanted to do it as a kind of as a context. But when you do global analyses, in general, it's found that what we've done to our landscape when we've done land use change to create agricultural land has generally at best kept the soil. When we've converted to arable land, nearly every global study says you lose soil carbon. When you convert from either woodland or pasture to arable, nearly every study says you lose carbon. If you then convert arable back to grassland or trees, you nearly always increase carbon. That's just a generality. So if you think about what a lot of agricultural is, a lot of it's arable. I know most of you are interested in grassland, and it basically depends on your soil type, whether you gain or lose carbon when you go from what is our climax vegetation in the UK is generally considered to be mainly woodland. We've lost most of our woodland. We converted it to farmland. either grassland or arable. Arable will have lost carbon. Grassland, depending on your soil type, lots of different studies suggest some might go up, some might go down. So it wouldn't have been linear. I was just trying to put it in context. So it's a bit of a dangerous thing to do. I was just trying to suggest that. So Felicity, hope that helps. And I've just replied to Bernie. Obviously, people think I'm in the pocket of some horrible industry people. We're a not-for-profit charity. We're an independent research organization. We were previously owned by NERC, which is the Natural Environment Research Council. We will not do research for anyone that doesn't allow us to publish the findings in peer-reviewed literature. We're a not-for-profit charity. We're not in the pockets of anybody. But anyway, hope I made that clear. Thank you.
Thank you. That's brilliant. It has actually started flying around in the chat, which is a little bit terrifying whilst I'm trying to listen to your answers and work out what to ask next. But so if I don't catch up with the chat, then you have my apologies. I have a follow-up question for Anna, actually, which again might be sort of my version of a question rather than anyone else's. But so we're talking about, you mentioned it with the, it's the bit of a wild west out there in relation to carbon credit schemes at the moment. So what happens if a farmer may be selling carbon credits now and then in effect will need to buy them back in the future? Is there, what is the risk with these sort of systems?
Yeah, I mean, there is a risk at the moment that farmers could currently sell carbon credits. There's nothing to stop people from generating these carbon credits and selling them into schemes. The main risk there is that as we get closer to net zero targets, that compliance markets and regulations from governments become tighter and tighter, and that lots of industries, not least the food industry, and retailers will have to tighten their carbon reporting, and this, is likely to feed back down the supply chain. I'm not saying that will happen, but that seems the likely direction of travel. And there is a lot of talk that give it 10 years, maybe longer, retailers might be requiring producers to be producing at low carbon products, basically, to be able to provide the carbon footprint of how they're producing. Whether that's a relative or an absolute level, we don't really know what that will look like. If that happens and the farm has essentially sold off all the offsets that they're able to generate themselves, they won't be able to then use those offsets against their own businesses. So you'll end up with those farms that maybe got ahead of the game now will lose out in the long term, and those that were perhaps more cautious now and held off may still have those offsets to be able to retain to offset their own emissions. So it does feel very much like another layer of gambling at the moment in terms of whether to engage or not. And this is why, I mean, I am a consultant, I sit within SAC Consulting, but we sit within Scotland's Rural College. We're not like many of the consultancies. We are very, very much linked in with research, and we're quite cautious about carbon credits and carbon marketplaces. Because I don't work directly with farmers as an agricultural advisor, I did have some catch-ups this week with advisors who are working directly with farmers and having those conversations day to day. And the impression I get is that clients are certainly not jumping into the carbon credit selling marketplace. There was much more conversation around working with farmer groups to create sort of cooperative type approaches for insetting, trying to work together on sort of innovation groups to generate low carbon products, and to be able to leverage those within supply chains as well, and negotiate sort of contracts for say premium prices for lower carbon products at farm gates. I think that seems to be, there seems to be more incentive and actually better reward for doing that potentially. I don't have hard figures on that better reward, but it certainly seems more sensible. And my own personal instinct is that from an investor's level as well, the level of risk in investing in farm level carbon sequestration credits would be relatively high. I mean, certainly if I was an investor, I would personally rather be investing in the kind of technologies and other approaches that are facilitating lower carbon agriculture. through technology and other approaches, rather than going about trying to invest in individual farm level projects. I think that the level of risk is just, and uncertainty is quite high.
That's a very good point. I think was some of the sort of low carbon schemes, they're more, they sort of cyclical, aren't they? You renew your submission to them. So
sorry, which carbon schemes? They're like
so the emission reduction, your low carbon schemes, they're less set than the carbon credit selling schemes, aren't they?
I'm not sure. I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure what you mean. So like government schemes.
Yeah, so they've got the emission reduction schemes in effect.
Yeah, I'm trying to think which schemes are currently live. I mean, the schemes that I've been involved with at a Scotland level have mainly been on the reporting side. And as far as I'm aware, at a Scotland level, no farm business has been required to reduce emissions by any amount. The focus has just been on trying to capture that data and facilitating individual businesses to be able to optimize their, mainly efficiency and productivity and profitability as a result, and carbon being a part of that.
Yes, yeah, that's true. I mean, we were involved in the Scottish government were asking people to account for their carbon at one point quite recently, as part of the farming advisory service.
Yes, so that's certainly been the focus of, and that was the kind of work I was involved in when I was working with AgriCalc. Was a large focus of my role was supporting governments. So I'm more familiar with the work in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, and the focus was very much on just baselining where the industry is at and where individual businesses are at, and providing the tools for businesses to be able to, I guess, sort of self-manage and self-optimize. With a clear focus on productivity as well. And that was driven initially by the beef efficiency scheme in Scotland, which is about 10 years old now, I think.
That's true. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I was trying to alternate questions and suddenly I've asked you three in a row. Bridget, there's a couple of sort of discussions in the chat mentioning it, and actually somebody sort of quite succinctly put it that they wondered if there was any differences in carbon sequestration between different types of grasslands, so more productive grassland versus species rich grassland. And in the chat they discussed also the sort of rooting depth of different grasslands as well. And so I just wanted your opinion on that.
Yeah, I wish we had better information on that. And that variability is, when I was talking about the ranges that we see, that is where some of that diversity come from. And what we would all imagine to be the case, if you have deeper rooting plants, if you have more continuous cover, if you have more diverse grasslands, that means when you have climate extremes going up and down, you might not then get losses of carbon because you've got plants that can respond more. I will say that currently our numbers aren't great in sort of saying definitively if you're on this soil type and if you've got that type of mix of grass species on this. What we all imagine is that it's going to be probably better for soil carbon, the more diverse and the more deep rooting that you have. Both for resilience, but for capturing carbon, that's going to be better. But if I was going to point you to the definitive publication, which has really done that very well, I can't do it. We don't have it. I mean, there's some great publications by a colleague, Lisa Norton, who did mob grazing because we had great hopes for mob grazing, but actually she was really struggling to find some of the increases we all expected that mob grazing might do. That's not to say the more studies we get, I mean, we just need more data and all of this, but within any of these, it looks like you get really big numbers when you have quite degraded soil. So there's a fantastic comment in the chat that on I think a very degraded construction site where nothing was happening, and then you see soil grow. Absolutely. We've got these meters of soil because we can grow soil. That does happen. It's quite slow. I mean, and when it's rock and you get a centimeter, that looks just great. So the soil does grow. That's how come we've got the soil we have. Otherwise it would just be rock. but it is quite variable. And I just wish we had better data that would mean that we could get more advice to people about, you can get another 10% if you do it this way. But currently, I'm not aware of any definitive publications that manages to really give that guidance to people. But, you know, our logic framework says more diversity, more deep rooting, you'll get more soil carbon. But Felicity, you know about this topic as much as me. Would you agree with me on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, you know, we haven't talked enough about biodiversity in my opinion. It's where I would be on this.
Yeah.
So there's a very active chat going on. There was one thing that this is a Felicity question rather than a chat question, really. But we've talked a lot about carbon sequestration and building up of carbon and how actually it builds up really slowly. What about would it be more important to try and preserve what we have, and what is the best way of maintaining carbon in the soils, would you say?
Absolutely. The first step should be keep what we've got. It's fantastic. And I'm quite surprised that some of the chat hasn't said, so pay us for what we've already got, because that usually comes to us in Wales, is that we pay people who've got fabulously diverse, rich hay meadows to keep them and not destroy them. So some people are, you know, have high carbon soils. Do we want to go down that line? Because it's also paying people not to cut down the Amazon rainforest. You know, there's a whole issue there where do we pay people to maintain what they've got? Sometimes, because that stock can just be due to nature, or it could be because you've done some great management. Anyway, so absolutely the first thing we've got to do is preserve what we've got. And that becomes really, really important in our peatland systems that we're managing for agricultural systems, because they are hot spots of greenhouse gas emission. So if you've got peatlands, they're absolutely amazing store of carbon, and they're massive hot spots of greenhouse gas emissions, because as we drain them and fertilize them and graze them, they are releasing this fantastic, they're not just releasing the carbon store, you've also got the ruminant emissions and the fertilizer emissions. So keep what we've got. And, you know, there are, one of the things is reduce tillage, you know, again, diversity, rotation, keep what we've got, and then let's see if we can grow it. Because we're all, I seem to have been misheard. I'm saying let's grow it. Let's do, it just isn't going to fill the gap that we've got. Thanks, Felicity.
Okay. No, that sounds fantastic. I mean, there's a lot, as I say, within them. In fact, somebody was mentioning peatland removal in the chat, and that is it is an issue, and any sort of agriculture management on peatland is a big problem and will release greenhouse gas emissions. And just actually utilizing peatland in general, it's currently a new project I'm working on, which I'm not going to discuss right this time, but that also, you've got a lot of land use conflict going on in effect. And it was again mentioned in the chat, thinking about that potential conversions between grasslands to woodlands, potential conflict between land use in relation to energy creation as well, all things that need to be thought about. Again, with some of the questions in the chat, it's sort of thinking about that diversity of sward, thinking about how we can preserve what we have, and then also building that in. I mean, what we haven't had a lot of real discussion on actually is that you know, the grasslands are there for a reason. It's not just to conserve, to build carbon. So we've got to think about that as a, you know, it's a farming system. Majority of grasslands in the UK are agricultural grasslands, and needing them to do what you want out of them, as well as storing carbon, is a way, you know, it's a combination of factors. If you can't farm the land, what's going to happen? So that might be something to bring in as well. So when we're thinking about the crediting system or building carbon, it's about what's best for that farm at the same time, isn't it? You can't just leave it in effect. So bringing in all the different ways of crediting is important. I'm seeing more things in the chat about different studies. So I think that if people keep an eye on the chat for the different examples, it's really going for it. Is there any more questions I haven't asked? And now this one is an interesting one. I initially put it down for Anna to answer, but it might be Bridget, I'm afraid. And that's how is it possible to compare one area without measures to build carbon under grassland versus areas which have been measured for a number of years? And actually touching on that point in relation to the carbon credit scheme, and whether you're paying farmers for what they have there or what they're going to do, it does seem wrong to, if you've degraded your soils to very, very low levels of carbon, and those are the people that will automatically get money because they start building them up again, in comparison to someone who's worked their lifetime to promote soil health and build carbon within the soils. It's something to be taken into account.
Yeah, this often comes up, and I have complete sympathy with that. And I've just put into the chat, because I'm sorry I missed who asked the question. We do know that the amount of soil carbon you've got in your soil is completely dependent on the soil type you have. Basically, we say the climate, but it's essentially the rainfall and what you're using the soil for. And we do national soil monitoring. You know, we just do that. The data is freely available, and we've used it to benchmark. And there's a tool that I've just put in the chat where you can go and say, so my soil type is this, and I can help. There's a little tool to say how you can go and get your soil type. My climate and my lower high rainfall, and I'm using it for arable improved grassland. Where is my soil? And I've measured my soil carbon, and it's this. Am I in the bottom bit or the top bit or the middle? You know, there's a distribution, right? And it might just help everyone go, well, someone else has managed to get double what I have, so perhaps I can go up. So there are ways of benchmarking people to say, you know, we want you to get to the typical number before we'll then give you money to go and get the enhanced level. So that could be one way. I'm not promoting it. It is quite a problem, but the same could be said for payments that we've made for decades relating to biodiversity. You know, we pay people to also protect and enhance biodiversity. And, you know, I just think sometimes soil people, we get it in the neck that, you know, we're the last one coming to the table, when the biodiversity people have kind of got there and get a lot of the money in a lot of the agri-environment programs, for example. So I think it's a fair point. There's options about how we can try and do that. But there's also the issue of, we're running out of time. I mean, if you're a climate change, you know, believer, we need to move things quite quickly, and we need to lead from the front here. But I totally get your other point, Felicity, which is we can't just offshore our food production. You know, we don't want to create a green and pleasant land in the UK while having lower environmental food production elsewhere elsewhere in the world. So we're totally trying to get an ethical, you know, sustainable option for farming in the UK going forward, and doing our part to help contribute to net zero. And all we're saying here is how much of soil and peatland restoration is part of that equation. So if that helps. But I can see the more I open my mouth, the more chat comes in. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing.
Yeah, try being me trying to listen and read at the same time. So we're nearing actually according to the schedule, it's time for some closing remarks, which I think it might be me giving them, but unless anyone wants to say otherwise. But first of all, thank you so much, Bridget and Anna and Becky, that for coming tonight, giving up your evening to give this very lively discussion on carbon sequestration. I've worked in the field of soil health for too long, 10, 17 years. How has it been that long? And still, there's just so much more to know. No one is an oracle on the topic. We can learn from each other and learn from the discussions, listening about the carbon markets and listening to just the facts in relation to carbon sequestration, Bridget, you've given is really, really helpful. And actually, it's that, you know, we become so tunnel visioned on one aspect of our research or our just everyday lives in relation to what you have done on your farm, that it can be that you can miss the bigger picture. So it's always great to get into a discussion with everyone to really see and understand what's happening. And in fact, someone's just half said it in the chat. I hadn't even heard of what was it? Your enhanced rock weathering. So
Weathering.
so I you know, I've heard of biochar, but I hadn't even heard of that part. So that's something I'm going to look up after this session. And that's the thing actually that we all need to keep in mind, that there is a lot of things that we don't actually know in relation to soil science, in relation to soil health. And actually there could be something coming along in the future which will help with farming. It could actually, there's things in the future that will actually be detrimental, that we need so we need to understand these different applications and methods before we give a wholehearted gold stamp to them, because otherwise you could be going down the wrong path. So hence why discussions like this are really, really important. And thank you both again for coming. And hopefully it wasn't too much of a firing spot.